adventurous disposition. Men who could afford to wore a lot of jewelry back then, mostly sewn into their clothes. So the subject here is either fairly discreet or not hugely wealthy. I would guess probably the latter. On the other hand, we can tell that he was prosperous, or wished us to think he was prosperous, because he is dressed all in black. She smiled at my look of puzzlement. It takes a lot of dye to make a fabric really black, she explained. Much cheaper to produce clothes that were fawn or beige or some other lighter color, so black clothes in the 16th century were nearly always a sign of prosperity. She considered the painting appraisingly. It's not a bad painting, but not a terribly good one either, she went on. It was painted by someone who knew how to prime a canvas, so he'd had some training, but it is quite workaday and not well lighted. The main thing is that if it is Shakespeare, it is the only portrait known that might have been done from life. So this would be what William Shakespeare really looked like, if it is William Shakespeare. And what are the chances that it is? I asked. Without documentation of its provenance, we'll never know, and it's unlikely now, after such a passage of time, that such documentation will ever turn up. And if not Shakespeare, who is it? I asked. She smiled. We've no idea. If the Chandos portrait is not genuine, then we are left with two other possible likenesses to help us decide what William Shakespeare looked like. The first is the copperplate engraving that appeared as the frontispiece of the collected works of Shakespeare in 1623, the famous First Folio. The Droeshout engraving, as it is known, after its artist, Martin Droeshout, is an arrestingly, we might almost say magnificently, mediocre piece of work. Nearly everything about it is flawed. One eye is bigger than the other, the mouth is curiously mispositioned, the hair is longer on one side of the subject's head than the other, and the head itself is out of proportion to the body and seems to float off the shoulders, like a balloon. Worst of all, the subject looks diffident, apologetic, almost frightened, nothing like the gallant and confident figure that speaks to us from the plays. Droeshout is nearly always described as being from a family of Flemish artists, though in fact the Droeshouts had been in England for 60 years and 3 generations by the time Martin came along. Peter W. M. Blaney, the leading authority on the First Folio, has suggested that Droeshout, who was in his early 20s and not very experienced when he executed the work, may have won the commission not because he was an accomplished artist, but because he owned the right piece of equipment, a rolling press of the type needed for copperplate engravings. Few artists had such a device in the 1620s. Despite its many shortcomings, the engraving comes with a poetic endorsement from Ben Jonson, who says of it in his memorial to Shakespeare in the First Folio, "Oh, could he but have drawn his wit, as well in brass, as he hath hit his face, the print would then surpass all that was ever writ in brass." It has been suggested, with some plausibility, that Jonson may not actually have seen the Droeshout engraving before penning his generous lines. What is certain is that the Droeshout portrait was not done from life. Shakespeare had been dead for 7 years by the time of the First Folio. That leaves us with just one other possible likeness, the painted, life-size statue that forms the centerpiece of a wall monument to Shakespeare at Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon, where he is buried. Like the Droeshout, it is an indifferent piece of work artistically, but it does have the merit of having been seen, and presumably passed as satisfactory, by people who knew Shakespeare. It was executed by a mason named Gerard Jansen, and installed in the chancel of the church by 1623, the same year as Droeshout's portrait. Jansen lived and worked near the Globe Theatre in Southwark, in London, and thus may well have seen Shakespeare in life, though one rather hopes not, as the Shakespeare he portrays is a puffy-faced, self-satisfied figure, with, as Mark Twain memorably put it, the deep, subtle expression of a bladder. We don't know exactly what the effigy looked like originally, because in 1749 the colors of its paintwork were refreshed by some anonymous but well-meaning soul. 24 years later, the Shakespeare scholar Edmund Malone, visiting the church, was horrified to find the bust painted and ordered the churchwardens to have it whitewashed, returning it to what he wrongly assumed was its original state. By the time it was repainted again, years later, no one had any idea of what colors to apply. The matter is of consequence because the paint gives the portrait not just color but definition, as much of the detail is not carved on but painted. Under whitewash it must have looked rather like those featureless mannequins once commonly used to display hats in shop windows. So we are in the curious position with William Shakespeare of having 3 likenesses from which all others are derived, 2 that aren't very good by artists.